All right, so we're on location in Greenville, South Carolina for a very special edition of the Week in Review. As you know, we have been covering the Rose Petal murder. This is a graphic, ritualistic slaying that took place up here in the upstate of South Carolina, the suburban subdivision, back in October of 2021. Now, this case, again, stoked fear across the upstate, as for several weeks it wasn't immediately clear who was responsible for this crime. There were 2 arrests made, but to the surprise of those covering the case, neither of them were for murder. It was only 3 weeks later that there was an arrest made of a concert pianist who apparently had no connection whatsoever to the victim, a 41-year-old vet tech named Christina Parcell. Now, this story has so many twists, so many turns, so many different narratives, and I'm joined now, Dylan Nolan, Troy Stiles, Jen Wood. You guys have been watching this trial for the past week, the murder trial of Zach Hughes up here in Greenville. The state's got a tough job here because, again, this is not a simple case. They've got a lot of different elements to prove. And Jen, I want to start with you because you've been covering kind of the key players of this case. Let me just ask you a bottom line question. Has the first week of the trial made this incredibly complex and confusing case any clearer, or do you have more questions than when it started?
Well, I think you have to look at it from the jury's perspective. And for me, no, I think it's confusing. It's still confusing. I don't think it's any clearer. I think the jury's confused. It's been probably the most interesting trial I've ever watched.
You know, a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different things that juries are trying to comprehend in this case, but also the jury doesn't know everything. Troy Stiles, Blunt Force Media, I wanted to bring you in here. You guys have done a great job, by the way. Love your site, love your outlet, all that you're doing. Talk to us a little bit about the aspect of this case that has not been introduced as evidence, that has not been presented to the jurors. Tell us about the child sex abuse material or child porn, whatever we want to call it, that is sort of lingering at the outskirts of this case and could potentially blow this trial up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the defense certainly has dropped it a couple of times. So they've definitely led the jurors into maybe speculation of the child pornography and materials, but certainly there's been a lot of whiplash, and there's been some boring times. The state really hasn't laid out a roadmap for jurors to follow, and quite frankly, I think they've kind of fallen asleep.
Yeah. We'll give folks a little background about this. We're talking about these allegations related to the child sex abuse material, the child porn. They fit into this murder because when police came to investigate the murder, not only did they see this incredibly ritualistic, bizarre, staged crime scene of a dead body stabbed multiple times with rose petals sprinkled around it, but they also found this child porn evidence. So who has that been linked to? Who's the person in this trial that has been directly linked to?
Well, certainly Bradley Post, has been the key player in the child pornography, and Christina is, of course, the ex-fiance of Bradley Post, and that's really all that we know. There are other names, that come into play in this case, but those have been the key elements of the child pornography. Now, the jurors didn't hear anything about that, though. All they heard from Bradley Post is that he has the 9 charges. They have no idea what those are. Mm-hmm. And Bradley Post, he was the first witness on the stand. He did a great job. He came off very honest and authentic. I don't think they really understood why he was there. His testimony was merely focused on finding the body of Christina, and that's really all that we heard from him in his orange jumpsuit.
Yeah, so I'm sure the jurors were looking at that a little bit. Dylan Nolan, let me ask you, you've been covering this all week. You've been covering this story for a while before that. Let me ask you this. We've got a killer whose DNA has been found under the fingernails of the victim. We've got a witness watching him put a mask, gloves, and a hoodie on a block away from the crime scene. We've got camera footage of him going into the house where Christina Parcell was murdered. How is this a hard case?
It's a hard case, I think, because of some of the aforementioned confusing elements. I think the jurors, you have to look at it from their perspective. We know the charges that have been filed against Bradley Post, but they see the former fiance of the victim coming in an orange jumpsuit and know that he's been charged with 9 crimes. And you also have to remember, although the judge instructs these jurors at the beginning of the proceedings, if there's an objection, if I have to take you out of the courtroom, this is not something you should consider. these people aren't robots. They're human beings. So they're going to consider, okay, why is the state jumping up and objecting to us hearing about this when they can tell that they're on the edge of learning something? I think that would make anybody uncomfortable. The other thing, Christina's sister, Lutina Parcell, took the stand, and I could actually see during cross-examination when she was very combative with the defense, you could see multiple jurors' eyes rolling. So I think that there have been things that aren't adding up for them. And you said we saw him walk in, meaning we saw Zach Hughes walk in. We saw a figure walk in. You said we had the eyewitness. Well, today on cross examination, we had the defense attorneys pretty effectively pull apart why did the investigators not identify this eyewitness until they sat down with the solicitor shortly before this trial to put it all together. It's certainly strange when they did all of this investigative work directly after the crime. They don't have this eyewitness until right before the trial, and that definitely goes to the credibility of that witness. And also, I mean, I don't know what folks will assess her credibility to be in general. But as you say, Zach Hughes, they've documented, turned off his phone on the day of the crime. They've documented, I think, pretty well that this is not just a murder trial. This is also a trial for harassment. I think they brought in a lot of evidence which indicates that John Mello and Zach Hughes may have been working together to send these harassing letters in the mail. So I think that the state is a lot closer to proving that charge than they are to proving the murder charge. That being said, at the conclusion of today's testimony, the state rested, and this means that next week the defense will either put up a case or they could conceivably rest themselves. We also had the judge instruct Zachary Hughes of his rights. He might take the stand, so it's all very up in the air as to what the defense will do. But the state is definitely not going into the defense's case here with a slam dunk, I think. I mean, I've seen other murder trials where you get to the point where the state rests and you're like, I don't know what the defense could conceivably do to get a not guilty verdict for this defendant. And
You
while
didn't
I
feel
could,
that way this
no,
time.
I could completely understand at this point if the jurors were to find Zach Hughes guilty, but I could also completely understand how half of them might be really hung up on what the heck is going on, what the heck don't they want me to know, and I could also see a lot of these holes which the defense, which by the way they have been very laid back, they have not been objecting very much. They have clearly been waiting to make their case after the state. They did not give an opening statement at the beginning of the trial. I think that the defense might be about to put on a serious show here in the coming week.
Well, you mentioned the name John Mello, and I want to get back to him in a minute because this is one of the key figures of this case, kind of an unindicted, alleged co-conspirator, if you will. But Jen Wood, I wanted to ask you about this. You've been watching these jurors. We've gotten reports that the jury, they start looking at each other when this Bradley Post evidence is referenced, or when Bradley Post's phone or anything to do with Bradley Post, they've started sort of looking at each other a little bit, and one or two times, okay, it's it's out of sight, whatever, out of mind. 3 or 4 times it starts to sink in. This is now several dozen times that these jurors have had to be sent out of the room or instructed as it relates to this particular line of questioning. They're starting to realize that something's going on that they don't know about. And here's, I guess, my question. Do you think, as Dylan alluded to, maybe they're going back and, hey, getting on this computer, who is this guy? What is he charged with? How many of those jurors do you think really know what he's been charged with?
It's a good question. You know me, I'm a rule follower. So
So if you were on the jury, you wouldn't do it.
I think it would be very difficult. Would be natural curiosity. I would guess probably quite a few of them have.
You think they have?
Yeah. And I think the defense is trying to give them a little roadmap to that, in as much as they can. They were cross-examining one of the witnesses on the cellular forensics, and Andrew Mormon, one of the defense attorneys, asked, well, you downloaded data from all these phones and presented it to the jury. Let's talk about the phone that you downloaded that the jury didn't know about. And I could see the solicitors just tense. I mean, the hands on the table, ready to object. And did you download data from Bradley Post's phone? Yes. When you downloaded that data, did you forward that data to a Greenville County Sheriff's Office investigator?
Those are some serious breadcrumbs.
Right. And defense objected, overruled, proceed cautiously. And I watched Andy Mormon walk the tightest tightrope. I mean, it was probably some of the best lawyering I've ever seen. He would take, he took like 30 seconds before asking a question to think about how to ask it.
And what's the goal? Just to raise
The
doubt?
goal is to I think it's to give the jury some breadcrumbs. Did you end up providing that evidence to investigator so-and-so? I can't remember the guy's name. I mean, he got as far as he could go and he never crossed that line. But they clearly know.
Something's up.
Right.
Something's, I mean,
And now they know it was from a cell phone. They know it's from a device that contains.
Well, and let's talk about devices. We also had, and this was put in front of the jury, the fact that Brad had a duplicate, a clone of Christina's
Yes,
cell phone.
that was weird. I forgot about that. Thank
Which,
you.
okay, we all have Life 360 on, or Find My Friends on iPhone with our spouse, with our members of our family. But to have a duplicate of their device is certainly strange, and that's not something that was explained. And whatever, people can do whatever they want with their relationships, but there's a lot of unexplained loose ends that the state has not done a very good job of putting into a cogent narrative. You got the clone of the phone. You've got, why is Brad in here in an orange jumpsuit? There's a bag of cocaine on the scene that nobody has explained where the bag of cocaine
We
came
talked about the analysis of the cocaine, how it was cut up with other substances. Okay, so what's the point?
Right. If I'm a juror, I'm like, okay, is this a drug deal?
Right.
Or I don't know. But when you're the state and you rest and you have this many loose ends which have been introduced as evidence because they had to be introduced as evidence, you can't have a bag of cocaine at your murder scene that you don't address. I think this is something that the defense is going to hop all over and say, look, you're prosecuting this Zach guy. He has no connection to any cocaine. There's cocaine at the scene. I think there's certainly a lot that they can play with next week.
Mm-hmm.
if they do. And again, we were walking out of the court and we heard one of the lawyers say, if we present a defense, if, forget Zach Hughes taking the stand, they were saying, if we even present a defense, which is just, I would think
That tells you how they feel about the state's case if that's even on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to that case, and I want to bring you guys both in this because you've spoken directly to this key player that is kind of, I guess, the shadow producer overseeing all of this. In fact, some people believe he's the producer of the murder. That's been hinted at on numerous occasions by those close to this investigation. Obviously, Mr. Mello, John Mello, and his attorney vehemently deny that. In fact, I spoke with his attorney the other day, and he said, look, if he was in any way involved in this, they would have had evidence in those phone messages, the WhatsApp messages. They would have arrested him by now. But let's talk about John Mello. This is a guy who was correct in that his young daughter, the daughter of the victim, Christina Parcell, was being abused. She was being abused. And in fact, his lawyer said, look, he was having to take her and drop her off on the order of a court to be abused. You guys have talked with him. What kind of man is John Mello, and what role is he playing in these proceedings? Troy, let's start with you.
I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could send my child somewhere where I knew that they were being abused, first of all. So when it comes to the harassment, which has been laid out pretty clearly to the jury, of course, the jury hasn't heard from John Mello. He's talked about very often. In fact, some parts of this trial, I've wondered who's on trial here, Zachary, Hughes, or John Mello. But he's not in the room. And as far as John's told us, he hasn't been subpoenaed. So it's odd, right? As far as, what kind of guy is John Mello? He's a likable guy. He also, he gets into conversation. He's got this whole script in his mind. So when you take him off of that script, and this is before we met with John together, I was like, when we talk to him, you have to just kind of interrupt him and kind of reset where he is, or he'll just keep going down that path. So, he'd be talking about whatever he's talking about, and I would stop him and just interrupt him really and say, hey, what was that music research about? And he would be completely, not in his script anymore.
And that's
We'll
a
just say
reference, obviously, to one of the WhatsApp messages that was sent the day of the murder, which prosecutors are implying is code for, hey, did you successfully murder, my ex-girlfriend?
Yeah, that was the
let me tell you.
home run.
Yeah.
But it's not really coming off as a home run. And I mean, the harassment is clear, right? He harasses we've heard from the guardian ad litem who spoke of, John Mello accused her of manufacturing child porn in her practice, and there's just all these things that he does. And everybody that has spoken of John Mello has at some point kind of been harassed by him. But he's a man of um, persistence. He really wants to be heard. And in this case, he's not being heard, and he's friends with Zachary Hughes. He really is, he says, a man's man. That's what he says a lot of times. He's a man's man, and Zach's a man's man, and they enjoy a lot of the finer things in life, like cigars and wine and music. And John's a very interesting guy. I showed you a video of him playing a nose flute. I've never heard of a nose flute, so I really enjoyed my time with him. But it comes off as all scripted, and when you take him off of that script, that's where you really get the real John Mello. Now, do I think that he conspired to have Christina killed? I'm not sure that he did that, Will, because two things could be true at once. He could be harassing her, and he could have asked Zachary Hughes to harass her and not have asked Zachary to kill her. But if he constantly fed information about this daughter, and then you have to go back to the bond hearing for Zachary Hughes and think about what people are saying about him. Zachary Hughes has a ton of support in the courtroom. There's a lot of key players in Greenville that are prominent people that are highly respectable. So for those people to show up every day and to consistently do so, as long as this trial is taken to even get onto the docket and be heard, there must be something great about Zachary Hughes, and that's what people say about him. He's a great guy. So are people going to think that that he's guilty of being a monster, or are people going to think he was trying to save a child here? We'll just have to wait and see.
They don't know that he was trying to save a child.
That's right, but they're getting it in every chance they
I'd
get.
like to point out something though. You said he was right about the daughter.
Being abused.
He said he
Right.
didn't know.
Right.
That's
Okay.
all.
He didn't know about the child pornography, but he submitted a DSS report, which was then unfounded by DSS, wherein his daughter reported that sleeping naked with both Bradley Post and her.
He reported that his daughter said that.
And she then told the DSS caseworker the same thing and said in an interview, I don't know, why this happened.
Okay.
That's in the report.
Well, John says that he didn't know about the actual child pornography until after the murder. But he did have indications that the child that just things weren't normal about the sleeping arrangements, other things that just made him feel uncomfortable as a parent.
But let's be honest, he's also pulled a lot of stuff out of his ass on this case. He's made a lot of allegations that had no
As I
substance.
said last week, I can see why, the true thing that he said gets lost in the other things that he says.
Right. Well, that leads me to ask you, Dylan, and you guys were sitting with him just this week. What is your take on John Mello?
One of the interesting questions I had for John Mello is, do you think you're going to be indicted at the end of this? And he's emphatic that he won't be. And I don't think he'll be indicted for conspiracy to commit murder, because we've now seen the state's whole case. I didn't see anything that would be able to nail him on a conspiracy to commit murder charge. The text messages or WhatsApp messages that were shown yesterday were certainly compelling on the mail front. I mean, you see him and Zachary discussing dropping things off in a post box in Greenville in a disguise. You see them talking about a burner phone. You see him saying harass the shit out of her. And now these messages are not, they're kind of in pig Latin, the way that WhatsApp encrypts things. So it's open to interpretation. And John will say, that's not what I meant by any of this stuff. And the investigators are only playing select messages. But I could certainly see that not going well for John, that part of the case. But as Troy says, if they're conspiring so much to do, the male side of this case, the harassment side of this case, why? And they're doing it, on record on these encrypted text messages. Where's the conspiracy to commit murder?
Well, I think the argument was they did that
In person
when Hughes was over in Italy with
But
him.
why not try to prosecute Mello first and then use that conviction in court to make the case against Zach?
Yeah, why not try Mello for harassment first and then do the Hughes murder?
Mello's unpredictable.
Mello's also beaten them once.
Yeah.
That is true. He was
Yeah.
Charged
Exonerated.
with custodial interference and was indeed exonerated. Not only did he win the trial, it was a directed verdict from the circuit court judge, Barry Gravely. So an emphatic win for John Mello in that court case. Guys, we're halfway through this thing, or at least we think. Again, presuming the defense does go forward with a case, potentially with Zach Hughes testifying. Let me ask you this. If the defense does present a case, and it does involve testimony from Zach Hughes, what do you think they're going to seek to do through his testimony? What are Mormon and Moyer going to attempt to portray to the jury as it relates to Zach Hughes?
He's very likable in person. I was surprised by that.
Zach Hughes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, he just, you see him smile at his friends and family. He seems like a nice guy. It's not somebody you would run into on the street and be like, oh. I think that could be very good. I mean,
Do you think he'd do well on the stand?
I think he might, yeah.
He's a showman. I've met Zachary Hughes. I've been in a room with him, in a room of people where he only knew one person. And when he first walked in the room, he was, kind of filling out the room, very quiet. And within 5 seconds, maybe, 30 seconds, he was in the kitchen and there was a group of people around him listening to basically eating out of the palm of his hand. He is a showman, Will. So I think he very well could take the stand in this case. He may want to take the stand in this case. And if he does, I think he'll set it on fire up there.
But how do you get over the questions that investigators will certainly ask on cross, or prosecutors rather, which is, why was your phone off on the day of the murder? Like, who's putting their phone on airplane mode for some very suspicious timelines? There's a lot of things right now that are reasonable doubt that I think that on cross-examination would get turned into things that are not good for Zach. I think he stands to lose a lot more.
How'd your skin cells get under the victim's fingers? Yeah.
Right.
They're missing a lot of points to this too, because his life's goal was to do these sonatas, right? He's going to do the 32. And on literally a week after the murder, he dropped that 30-second one. And I can't remember what the post was, but it was like, I think he said the last word, the final word. Yeah. That was his post. So it's like life accomplishment. It seems like the climax of his goal in life to do these 32 sonatas, and then the climax was possibly allegedly this murder.
Well, I want to throw this out to you guys too, because we are headed toward whatever happens with this case, whatever verdict is reached. This is going to be one hell of an appeal, not only as it relates to the inadmissibility of, up to this point anyway, we don't know whether or not someone says a magic word that ushers all this child porn evidence in, but up to this point, no admission of child porn. That's going to be a huge basis for an appeal. But let's also think about what the defense laid out at the end of the state's case today. At the end of the state's case, they moved for a mistrial. And the argument there was that this chain of custody, that the DNA evidence, which again is really what's hanging him right now, that was not properly established by the state. And in fact, they referred to the testimony of one of the forensic analysts from the DNA lab who prepped these samples, referring to going to the law enforcement center and saying they gave me these pieces of evidence.
Don't they have, I mean, I've FOIA'd for chain of custody. I've seen it. Don't they have a sheet of paper that says this person took it, handed it over to this person, they sign it?
Absolutely. In fact, how do they identify every piece of evidence that gets put into exhibit through the signature? So, I mean, this is one thing they have to get right. And they know that from the very beginning of an investigation. So if they got that wrong, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the motion was denied. And then immediately after that was a motion for a directed verdict. And obviously, if you're familiar with murder trials, this happens at the end of the state's case.
Not just murder trials, every trial.
Yeah.
And this is why it's remarkable that that's how John Mello won his case, because usually it's pro forma, but it doesn't go well for the defendant.
Yeah.
And in this case, it didn't go well for the defendant, but of course, we would have all bet, our lives that it wasn't going to.
Yeah. But all these items coming up on appeal, this case isn't going to be over anytime soon, is it?
I've lost track of the tally marks. The defense, they've just got a chalkboard up there, and it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, they are getting them in.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of, there's this case in particular, which there's a lot of grounds for appeal. But then there's also what's going to happen with Bradley Post, who's being prosecuted by the South Carolina Attorney General's office. And then is there any future legal action taken against John Mello, which I think at this point is still a fair question to ask.
So Dylan, you and I were in the courtroom today, and we'll share this with you guys as well. The DNA evidence was dropped today. It was the last
It was going to be the whole.
Final word, as
Right.
Zach Hughes would say. It was the last act. The conclusion was very damning. It was that the DNA found under Christina Parcells' fingernail 825 million times more likely to be Zach Hughes than some random other offender. So that was laid out, but I was watching the jury as this evidence was being introduced. And again, this is the case. This is the key moment. And by the way, there were some very nifty defense objections during that testimony at certain times. Right when it appeared we were going to get this announcement, they kind of messed with the prosecutor's flow. But I'm watching those jurors, and this was the kind of thing that really needs to hit in their soul. It needs to really pierce them as they head into this long weekend waiting for the defense to make their case. I didn't really see a look on their faces like it hit that hard.
I don't. So I was thinking when you mentioned that earlier, I was thinking, yeah, I've watched the jury a lot during this trial, and other than a few key moments, they have not been overly reactive. Even when they were shown, graphic photos of the crime scene, they're being very stoic. I mean, there have been some moments when you're kind of like, what's going to happen with the objections and, the defense trying to get in that CSAM material. But in general, they have been fairly unreactive. And ending the case on DNA, I mean, science is not over, like, it's an interesting choice. I think it's the strongest part of their case, but who gets excited about like,
We also have to remember that, after the defense presents their case, the state will have another crack. And I will bet
Right.
you that they will bring up
Right.
lead investigator or somebody else in that capacity to tie it all together. Because the solicitor's opening argument was really not, it did not go into the details. I did not find it to be very compelling.
It was fast.
It was 7 minutes long,
Yeah.
and 7 minutes and change long. Didn't go into any of the details, and I don't feel like they really ever buttoned it up. So I think that they're going to need to come back in their reply to the defense's case and put it all together for these jurors. Because the way that we left that courtroom today, I can see why the defense is like, I don't know if we even put on a case.
I don't even know if the jury knows where they are in this case. I mean,
It's confusing.
It is, and the confusion is obvious. I mean, when you're watching a jury, you're paying, of course, paying attention to if they're yawning, if they're awake, if they're engaged, but you want to see a tennis match, right? You want to see the head go back and forth. You're not really seeing that. And I mean, they are not really engaged, as Jen mentioned. And there have been parts where, they've heard and you can tell they're tuned in and they're interested, but then they lose track of, it's like something comes after that doesn't connect to what they just heard. And then they lose track of where they are. It's like a piñata.
Yeah.
It's funny for myself, who's been following this for years at this point, who understands, okay, we've got this harassment case, we've got this murder case. It's pretty easy for me to track, okay, this witness is coming out to talk about this thing, they moved on to that. But it's not always clear. I think if you're listening to that from the jury box, you heard in the beginning, like once, you heard the solicitor say, this is the indictment for harassment, this is the indictment for murder. But I don't know that it's been reinforced in their mind enough exactly what the heck is going on. And I think that's why, we see the confusion in their face, but also, I mean, even for the folks in the media who know what's going on, this case is not extremely cogent in the way that it's been presented.
I mean, you started out with a guy in an orange jumpsuit who has 9 mysterious charges, and he found his ex-fiancée, who he married in an airport, dead. In the most gruesome crime I think Greenville County has ever seen. I mean, I said to you earlier, Will, number 1, this is Greenville County, and number 2, it's Canebrake community.
Yeah.
They're both
A
safe.
suburb, yeah.
I
And
don't
these
know.
were some we heard testimony just this week. The graphic nature of this crime ended up being 35 sharp force wounds. I believe it was 27 to the head and neck area, more the rest to the body area. One punctured a lung through the
left
breast.
yes.
Just horrific injuries, and the description of those, I thought the forensic pathologist, Dr. Rose, who provided that description, just very dispassionate, but it was chilling to listen to it. That to me hit harder than even that DNA evidence, which is what really nails
Well, what did you
this
think
case.
of the state's choice to not show any, and they didn't earlier in the trial either, when you weren't present, they didn't show any images of Christina's body, which I think is an unforced error, because the Dr. Rose, she was great. She's clearly a consummate professional.
She is.
She's not an emotional person,
Not at all.
and that's fine for her job. But that then is incumbent upon the state to bring home to the jury what happened to to this woman.
They
They
had
need to show images.
pictures in the defense when they presented the crime scene evidence to the jury. They had a number of pictures, and the defense objected to some of them being
Unfairly prejudicial.
right.
Yeah.
Right, and the judge did sustain that and pulled 2 out, saying it was cumulative.
The one that the jury really, that I noticed that they reacted to, was the little clump of hair in the blood. It wasn't in the pooling, it was kind of near the pooling. That little clump of hair was focused, and then of course I think you guys published the hand, the bloody hand. That was the most graphic that I've seen, and I certainly expected to see way more than that to describe the scene and to drive it home.
But I think Jennifer's right about that ruling. I think that's probably why they didn't do that during this portion. But it's unfortunate for the state, because I think that would have made that testimony hit home, and I think that's part of why today it felt lackluster. I think they were probably anticipating being able to do that. On the topic of the judge's rulings for the defense, for the state, obviously the defense had a big loss when it comes to the child pornography evidence not being admitted. I know, Will, you've spoken with attorneys who are not related to this case in any way, but who are, expert practitioners of the law who agree with the judge's ruling and think it will stand on appeal. So I would obviously defer to them as somebody who's not an attorney. But I would say that there have been rulings during the trial which have gone for the state, rulings which have gone for the defense. To me, the judge has not seemed to be unfairly on one side or the other.
This judge has been absolutely one of my favorites I've ever watched. He's been very
Respectful, compassionate,
and
professional.
When there is an objection, or if there's a motion he needs to consider, I feel like he really listens. He doesn't rush anything, and he takes his time to make a decision, clearly reviewing case law closely. So I do think that in terms of the decisions he's made, they've been very thoughtfully considered. And, I talked to some lawyers today at lunch, and they said, they believe that, that material was more prejudicial than probative. And it made sense to them.
And let's go back to the fact that we were talking about earlier. John Mello, who would have presumably communicated this information to Zachary Hughes, which would have been a motive, did not know about this at the time, which means that it could not have been the motive. The child pornography could not have been the motive. So I understand why these attorneys believe that this would stand, because how could it have been the motive? How does it relate to the motive?
Right.
It's just a reason we would all want the victim to be dead.
Exactly.
And if the harassment is the motive, they kind of proved in a way that maybe John Mello fabricated the prostitution listings that were online, because there were some images that contained the watermark of the website and then some that didn't. The only part of the harassment that was consistent in Zachary Hughes' participation, we saw come back out in the text messages, and it was the way post was misspelled. Poast. That was consistent in the text messages as well as in the mailings, and that connected those. But John Mello's the nexus.
Well, we've talked about the defense leading breadcrumbs, but I think one of the things that the prosecution did very well as far as leading to breadcrumb when we're talking about motive, which again, they don't have to prove, but referencing that 6-month time frame from when a parent last sees the child, and Walt Wilkins, as he was closing out the testimony, says, now, what would the date have been for that 6-month window? And it was exactly at the moment of the murder. So that...
And Will, just for folks who aren't familiar, can you back that up a little bit as to what that 6-month window is that you just referenced?
Well, it's the time frame that if a parent has not either paid child support or held one of the
visitation,
authorized visitations,
which
they can
Mr. Mello had been in Italy at that point. So he had not done either of those things in the U.S. family court system.
And so the argument is that this was the only way to gain custody of his daughter.
Well, you can terminate parental rights, and you have to wait a total of 6 months, and of course not receive child support. So it was literally, they were at that exact mark.
The exact deadline. And that was a breadcrumb that was very deftly left by the prosecution. So question is, can the jury follow all these breadcrumbs and what is admittedly...
And this is why I think what I'm talking about, they're going to need to come and tie it all together. And what you and I were talking about, of the defense saying, well, maybe we just rest. I think that their calculus is not that they have nothing to say. Their calculus is that the state has left this presuming that the defense will make a case and assuming that they're going to be able to tie it all together after. If the defense doesn't make a case,
they don't get
the jury gets the question on Tuesday, and they get the question when it's really confusing.
Except they're gonna, that is assuming that the solicitor's office does not do this killer closing
That's
argument.
true.
I mean, they could come to play ball
Could pull it out.
Nail it down.
and put this together for the jury. I mean, if you put all of this together, you put that point in about the 6 months, you add in the DNA, you add in the harassment, you add in the escalating messages, the statements from the guardian ad litem that she was threatened by him. A jury could be like, yep, they just put
I
that
think
together.
if you tie this all together, there's certainly a compelling case to be made here. It's just feels very strange for the state to rest without having tied it all together. But
It's like-
I think it's going to come.
In the Murdoch trial, the state ended with Peter Rodolsky, the SLED agent, who put that timeline in front of the jury and made it make sense for the jury.
To say it's your tagline, Jen, make it make sense.
Yeah.
They need their make it make sense witness. They haven't had it yet.
They
but I
may
think
not
that
need
that's
it.
coming.
They could do that in closing.
They could do it in closing.
Or they could do it in their rebuttal.
The roadmap is what's missing.
Folks, just an incredible case up here. Obviously, if you haven't followed it, Rose Petal Murder on FITSNews.com, and check out Blunt Force Media. Troy Stiles and his outfit have done amazing work on a ton of different cases. If you don't follow them, please check their channels out and their socials. Just amazing work. But guys, this is a crazy case. We have a very conflicted victim. We've got a bizarrely unconnected suspect. We've got this mystery shadow producer in the shadows. It's one of those cases that, again, has not up to this point been able to nail down. We're going to see if prosecutors will be able to do it, or we'll be able to see if the defense will be able to poke holes in what the prosecution's already done, but we'll be able to see if the jurors were able to make sense of the case that was put before them by 13th Circuit Solicitor Walt Wilkins and his prosecution team. Guys, I can't thank you enough for helping break this down. It's just such a crazy case, and you guys have done an amazing job of helping us kind of get our bearings on it. Jen Wood, Troy Stiles, thank y'all so much. And Dylan, you're going to stick around. We got a lot of politics to talk, man.
We do. It's been a bombshell week.
So we'll be back with our political segment, but thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
All right, for our second segment today, we are pivoting to the world of South Carolina politics, where a thermonuclear detonation was dropped on the South Carolina governor's race. This is an election, again, still 15 months away. It's when the next Republican gubernatorial primary will be held. The frontrunners in the race are 1st District Congresswoman Nancy Mace and South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson. There are a number of other candidates who are thinking about running. In fact, one came into the race and then dropped out of the race within the last week, Thomas Ravenel, the former state treasurer and reality TV star. But as of this moment, Mace and Wilson are the two frontrunners. And for the last few weeks, Mace has been training her fire on Wilson, peppering him on social media and in some of her stump speeches about his lax record when it comes to human trafficking and when it comes to protecting child abuse victims, just landing punch after punch. But Dylan Nolan, she quit punching this week and dropped a full-scale hydrogen bomb on the Attorney General, a 1-hour speech on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, in which she accused her former fiance and 3 of his business associates of a sordid array of crimes, and then lit into the Attorney General for allegedly not prosecuting, not taking them seriously, and generally dropping the ball. Dylan, you've been watching the speech, you've been observing the fallout. How is Nancy Mace's bomb drop on the Attorney General playing so far?
It was interesting as this was hitting. Obviously, the whole South Carolina political world was in upheaval, as you said. And I was actually sitting at this table, which is here at our Airbnb that we're staying at here in Greenville. And as you know, when you're working on the court cases, we just did almost an hour talking about the complex and convoluted murder trial that we've been covering this week. So you don't usually have a lot of time to watch an hour-long congressional speech. But I made an hour of my night to watch this whole speech. And, my takeaways as I was listening to it is something bad clearly happened with Nancy Mace and these individuals. And now one of the unique things about being a member of Congress is so that members of Congress feel, free to speak about issues in the nation, they are protected. They have absolute immunity from, civil lawsuits brought against them for what they say in the well of Congress. We don't have that same protection. So the stuff that she said about all these guys, hasn't been proven in a court of law, hasn't, even been documented in civil trial documents that we could refer to. So,
But what's also interesting is that she does have that protection on the floor of the House, but this is a speech that was widely leaked prior to it being given. In fact, we posted on Twitter one of the leaked copies of this speech before it was given, and before and after the speech, excerpts have been plastered all over social media by Congresswoman Mace, including naming these, again, alleged assailants by name.
right. And I saw, the Post and Courier, the State both had pieces worked up prior to the speech that they dropped immediately after the speech. So yes, there is the distinct prospect that Nancy Mace is going to face legal action for distributing those statements outside of that protection. Regardless of that, all this to say, we don't have the legal protection to necessarily dive into the veracity of these claims because these were just things that Nancy was saying. I think that they were compelling. I think time will tell whether these things stand up in court, stand up in investigations, but they were certainly compelling.
But they were very specific. She cited specific numbers of files, specific locations, specific individuals doing specific acts, specific details from specific videos. I mean, it wasn't, random allegations. This was very detailed.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's very detailed, but you can make up details.
No, fair enough. The other interesting
And
part,
I'm not saying she did that. I'm just saying the specifics alone are not, dispositive.
the other interesting thing that worked, I believe, in Nancy Mace's favor is shortly after her speech was given, the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, which is the big state-wide law enforcement agency in South Carolina, released a statement confirming an investigation into her former fiance, one of the 4 individuals whom she named. And to a lot of folks watching this, that lent credibility to her allegations. But Dylan, there's one part of this speech that I think we got to be fair here and we got to put this out there. In fact, we were talking to some of the principals about this earlier today, as a matter of fact. But the allegations against Alan Wilson, let's be clear about something. Assuming SLED's investigation bears fruit regarding these 4 individuals that Nancy Mace publicly accused of these horrific crimes, it wouldn't go to Alan Wilson. It would go to Ninth Circuit Solicitor Scarlett Wilson, who is the prosecutor in Charleston County where these alleged offenses took place. So it is a little bit unfair to pin all of this on the Attorney General, who, according to his own statement, this was not a case he was even aware of until shortly before Mace took the floor.
Yeah, I mean, it's very convenient that her, number one gubernatorial opponent is the person that she decides to hit on the backs of these allegations, which may or may not be true. But I can tell you that, say you report a crime to law enforcement, you don't go and report it directly to a prosecutor. You report it to law enforcement. They will investigate, sometimes alongside with investigators associated with prosecutors, but they will conduct an investigation and then go to prosecutors. So we don't know the status of SLED's investigation. They could have an ongoing investigation. They could have closed an investigation.
Could be
They could be
something,
waiting
could
on
be
a piece of
nothing.
evidence. They could have sent it off to be analyzed at a lab by the federal government and be waiting back for something that they'll get in 6 months and then refer it to prosecution. But she presented no evidence, and it sounds like no evidence exists that this case was referred for prosecution to the Attorney General's office, and they decided not to prosecute. I think this was just out of nowhere a hit on a political opponent that was opportunistic. But here's another thing that we discussed. Most folks don't have a great idea of how the law enforcement process works, how all this investigation works. I mean, some folks, watch true crime content or are involved in the legal system, but a lot of folks, your average voter, probably doesn't know all this stuff and might this little 10-second clip might be the only thing that they see. And so you don't have to be saying things that are true to be saying things that might plant seeds in the minds of potential voters.
No, that's absolutely true. And let's talk a little bit about the reaction to this because we actually did something at FITSNews we haven't done yet. For those of you who don't follow, every week we produce 2 stock indexes, we call them, where we track national figures in one of those indexes and South Carolina figures in the other, and we assess their stock performance, whether they're rising, whether they're falling, whether they're holding. And so we actually had planned to drop our stock index the morning after Mace's speech. We actually held it until that night just to start taking a better inventory of the fallout from this seismic event. And Dylan, it's been very interesting. In the index, we talked about how national observers really were kind of recoiling, at least in the Beltway. But then there was this whole crowd of for lack of a better word, female Republican suburban voters that loved it. Here in South Carolina, the insiders, a very negative reaction to the speech. Is that consistent with what you're hearing?
Yeah, I think that your analysis of the different concerned parties definitely lines up with what I've seen talking to other people, and what I've heard on social media from folks that I don't necessarily know myself.
Yeah,
But it should be said that the opinion of folks in DC, we would have Nikki Haley as the president right now. The
absolutely.
opinion of the South Carolina political class in 2016, we'd have Marco Rubio as president.
That's right.
I think that appealing to your average voter is really how you win an election.
And I wanted to read a quote. This is from a text I got from a South Carolina Republican primary voter, a female down in the Low Country. And this is what she said to me in response to Nancy Mace's speech. How do I go work for Nancy Mace after what she had the nerve to get up there and do today? I mean, wow. I will burn the system to the ground if I have to. I've never wanted to join a cause so badly in my life. That is the target market, and that, Dylan, is the target response. And you and I have been following Nancy Mace for a while. She's not flying blind. This was a speech that was extensively promoted, that was aggressively promoted. They had to know what they were getting into in terms of net benefit versus potential fallout. And whatever you think of the veracity of the claims, it was a home run as far as delivery.
There is that. Now, you talk about these folks who are on the ground, the boots on the ground, people like what you just read. The other side of it, and I just talked about how these folks who are the politicos don't make all the decisions, but they do have all the money. And if you piss that group of people off, they might go and give a lot of money to somebody that you don't like. And I think that that group of people was ticked off by this performance.
Yeah, and in fact, we're hearing anecdotally that some of Mace's rivals in the Republican primary are receiving the financial benefit of the angst and blowback from this particular speech. And Dylan, we were talking earlier that funding from the donor class, while it may be a small thing now, that's the kind of thing that enables these candidates and campaigns to communicate and change these types of opinions from grassroots, from folks watching their internet feeds, getting those text message ads. It's the kind of thing that funds a lot of the, again, effective communication in those
When an
races.
election's coming up and you just can't get away from crap in your mailbox, from stuff in your cell phone inbox or your emails, everything that you're getting flooded with, that all costs money.
Yeah. A lot of those mailings were for Nikki Haley, weren't they? That Americans for Prosperity group, they went all in for Nikki Haley. That didn't work out too well in South Carolina, did it? Got a MAGA curb stomping here. Nikki Haley lost by about 20. Nancy Mace, though, while she got Nikki's endorsement in one of her congressional races, she has definitely pivoted to the MAGA movement over the last campaign and certainly now in
And
this.
after she disavowed Donald Trump after January 6th, Nancy's all over the place. She's kind of taken a page out of Nikki's book in that regard.
She has, but unlike Nikki Haley, she's been smart enough to, again, finger in the wind
To this point,
to this point. Yeah, we'll see. This is
Nancy likes to put all the chips in, and that's something that has worked out for her so far. And I would say Nikki puts all the chips in,
yeah.
and you see what can happen if that goes the wrong way.
So assessing this, we're obviously less than a week away, or less than a week out rather, from this big speech. We've seen it play out initially. We've seen sort of the initial fault lines form. Let's look long term. The impact of this speech, how much does it depend on the number and specificity and import of the receipts that she brings to buttress these allegations?
That's interesting. South Carolina, and this predates Alan Wilson taking office, but South Carolina is a state that has a lot of problems with human trafficking, with sex trafficking. And you talk to him about it, and he say he's the person who's built up the ability to respond to those things. And I think that there's truth in that, but there's also truth in the fact that you can dig up a lot of bad cases that have occurred in the last he's been in office for more than 10 years now, and you can point those back at him. Now, of course, he'll say, we wouldn't know about these cases if my investigators, if my prosecutors didn't go after them. But with South Carolina being a state that seriously does have a problem with these, sexual crime issues. I mean, look at what we report on. There's a lot of these types of problems here, and we don't even get really into the human trafficking side of things, but our state is one of the worst in the nation for that. I think that she's going to be able to pull up if she gets people digging in the right areas. And let's face it, there are folks who know where the bodies are buried who don't like Allen. I'm talking about other solicitors who might not, agree with him politically, who might be able to point her people in the direction of some cases that will be a lot more legitimate than the attacks that she was throwing at Allen here from the well of U.S. Congress. That could definitely hurt.
Well, another analogy we heard from one of Wilson's supporters was that Mace had awakened a sleeping giant. They referred to it as similar to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and that now Wilson stirred and potentially focusing his energies. And we're hearing from sources close to Wilson that he is taking this very personally. And again, he's responded above boards in everything that's been released from his office. I thought he had a very classy response personally, but we are told behind closed doors, steam coming out of the ears toward Nancy Mace. Again, Dill, we called it back in January. FITSNews said this was going to be the bloodiest governor's race ever in South Carolina, a state known for these kind of cutthroat candidates and candidacies, but we had no idea it would go radioactive this soon.
Yeah, I didn't think it would go radioactive this soon, and I see why he's peeved. I mean, he was completely unfairly treated in the well of Congress.
Yeah. Well, let's talk for a minute, and I know I'm surprising you with a question here. We like to typically prepare these things, but hey, you were in this office a little bit before you came to work for us, so you know a little bit about it. But in addition to the race for governor of South Carolina, we've published an article this week focusing for the first time on the emerging race for attorney general. Alan Wilson, obviously, if he does follow through as expected and seek the chief executive office here in South Carolina, he would vacate the top prosecutor job that he's held for the last 13 years. Many candidates expressing interest in the field. One of them, the son of the current governor, Henry D. McMaster. Very young guy, a guy who works at a big law firm in Columbia. Certainly got a good name for it. His dad, not only the sitting governor who served for the past 8 years, but also served 8 years as attorney general from 2003 to 2011, Henry McMaster. A number of other individuals potentially running. Stephen Goldfinch, a state senator from the PD region, is aggressively considering a bid for this office. We also hear reports that Creighton Waters, the lead prosecutor in the Murdaugh murders case, he might be looking at a bid. Dylan, as we look at this upcoming race, this is a very important position. In fact, some might argue, given how impotent the governor's office is in South Carolina and how muscular the AG's office has been in the last few terms under Alan Wilson, some might argue this office has more power.
I would argue it does have more power. Some would be right here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a really important race. I think if you're a partisan Republican, you want to make sure that somebody who actually is a partisan Republican gets that nod. There will be Democrats who are going to run as Republicans in this race. I would bet my bottom dollar on that.
Well, one of them we know very well, David Pascoe, the First Circuit solicitor.
And I really respect David Pascoe. But if you're a Republican who wants a Republican AG, that's probably not your guy. He certainly is a great prosecutor. You know, he doggedly pursues crime. I believe that he does that. But the AG's office of a state is something beyond just prosecuting criminals. It's also inherently a very important political position because your AG is going to file legal matters on behalf of the state when they believe that the federal government is acting up. And of course, what a Republican believes is acting up by the federal government and what a Democrat believes are very different things.
Yeah, that's true. David Pascoe, to his credit, though, has been one of the most aggressive voices in the Palmetto State in support of judicial reform. He's joined with Solicitor Kevin Brackett, a Republican up in York County. Those two have been...
He's talked to a lot of local GOPs on this judicial reform issue, and I wonder, David Pascoe's not a stupid guy. Anybody who says that David Pascoe's a stupid guy is wrong. I think that he's getting his face in front of a lot of these local GOPs, knowing that it's going to be crucial for him to win over Republican voters if he wants to become the next attorney general. And he's been doing that for years now. So certainly don't count him out as somebody who could switch the letter after his name to R and have a lot of people think that he has been a Republican for quite some time, because he's been talking to Republicans for quite some time. He's not one of these Democrats that doesn't know how to look to the other side of the aisle, which if you want to win a statewide position in South Carolina as a Democrat, you need to do.
Yeah. And also, he's been speaking to those groups on an issue that is, again, very
Nonpartisan. Everybody should
Yeah.
agree about that.
absolutely, but it's also one that ties to a system that's tougher on crime,
Mm-hmm.
that is imposing more
Values that
appropriate
Republicans,
appropriate sentences, not giving violent criminals bonds they don't deserve, really holding the judicial system accountable. That's a message that really resonates with GOP voters still.
certainly. But would he sue the government for what a lot of GOP voters think is federal or overreach of the federal government? Maybe he would. Maybe let's have him in studio and ask him what he would do on these lawsuits.
We're going to bring as many of these guys in as will sit down with us, as we've been doing on the governor's front. Dylan, the other thing that we were following this week, and I'll point this out just briefly, there's been a big debate in South Carolina over justice reform. And again, we've talked about it as it relates to judges, and FITSNews has led the charge in South Carolina to try and get a system that is more fair, again, to everyone. In South Carolina, for too long, powerful lawyer legislators have determined not only who gets elected judge, but who even gets to stand for those elections. They literally cherry pick the candidates they want. Dylan, you had a great story up this past week about, again, how badly broken that process continues to be, even after some very cosmetic reforms that were passed last year. But this week got dragged into a foxhole as it relates to the debate over tort reform. And for those of you who followed the big Murdoch case, remember it all began with a boat crash case and allegations of it was a dram shop action. Who was at fault for a boat crash in which alcohol was involved? And it was that case, while serving as the impetus for a lot of what happened in the Murdaugh murder saga. Guess what? It has also been the impetus for a huge debate at the South Carolina State House over the issue of tort reform and whether or not certain establishments that could be found 1% at fault for an accident, whether or not they should be able to be held 100% financially to blame, shoulder 100% of that financial burden. And so there's been a huge debate. The trial lawyer lobby in South Carolina over the last week has gone absolutely scorched earth. We thought Nancy Mace was scorched earth. Trial lawyer lobby has gone absolutely scorched earth, but they've also gotten some support from some MAGA accounts. A lot of popular MAGA accounts, DC Drain, a lot of these other folks.
Don Jr.
Don Jr. even retweeted one of them. And so now the trial lawyer is very emboldened now with Donald Trump Jr. seeming to be in their corner on this tort reform issue. But the guy who really holds the influence on this debate in South Carolina is not Donald Trump Jr., it's Shane Massey, the majority leader of the state Senate. And folks, they came after him. They tried to take his head off, basically accusing him of corruption, saying that he was acting in self-interest given his...
All-state Shane, they're calling him.
All-state Shane, they're calling him. And apparently everyone that sticks up for him or even covers him relatively impartially is in bed. And in bed with him, in bed with Allstate. By the way, I ain't getting any Allstate money. I'd like to get some of that Allstate money. It seems like they got a lot of money.
I'm doing more paying to insurance companies than I am receiving.
I know, man. We'd have a little better better setup with some of that Allstate money. But anyway, the trial lawyer's very angry at that coverage. We started getting lit up from it. But Dylan, this is something we've been talking about for a long time. And in fact, even during the boat crash case, when all of those barbs were going back and forth and Greg Parker was talking crazy trash about us. He's one of the guys that was implicated in that boat crash.
I think Greg Parker's position, though, I mean, I know that you and him didn't get along very well there for some time, but I think that Greg Parker's position that if you own a liquor store and you sell a minor who, I mean, I think you can agree that Buster and Paul Murdoch, for folks who don't know the situation, they look quite a bit alike. And what was it? The younger one, Paul, walks in with Buster's ID, which is he was of legal age. So you see one, ginger Murdoch looking guy. You see another ginger Murdoch looking guy. Now, granted, they're not the same exact height, so I think a reasonable person could have caught it. But you look at the ID, you think, this could be the same guy. Yeah. Sell him a beer. Well, it turns out that Parker's Convenience Store, which if you live in South Carolina, you've seen a million of them. They were the folks that ended up on the hook. Yeah, and beer apparently. they ended up on the hook for a far larger portion of this lawsuit than they ever should have been, simply because they were the ones with deep pockets and because that's how our state law is currently written.
Yeah. Well, and that's the case that a lot of the trial lawyers are now kind of looking back on saying,
We got a little greedy.
got a little too over our skis, so to speak, as we like to say here at FITSNews. But as this debate moves forward, again, the bill that's been put forward by Senator Massey, S244, this is a nut cutter. I mean, he's going for the jugular. And I had an interesting conversation with some senators, and they made it clear to me, Dylan, that their goal is not merely to reshape South Carolina's tort laws. That's part of what they're doing. But they made it abundantly clear that their focus here is more to target the trial lawyer lobby. They're tired of this lobby every year coming back, getting more power, translating that into more money, which they plow into political operations, which brings them more power, which brings them more money. They are trying to stop that cycle. And in fact, I spoke to some of the trial lawyer folks who reached out to me in the aftermath of this story we covered on FITSNews.com. And I told them, guys, they're not trying to pass a bill. They're trying to kill you to watch you die. Anyway, we'll be covering this debate pretty closely over the next few weeks because, again, you drag me into a foxhole, I'm going to stay in that foxhole. So, trial lawyers, be careful what you ask for. But again, we have an open mic here, Dylan.
And I think there are reasonable arguments to be made. I think there's arguments to be made that the insurance industry might benefit from this in a way that they shouldn't. And I think that somebody ought to write in and make that argument. When I'm not stuck covering a murder trial, every minute of every day, I'm going to certainly do more reading about this. But one thing is for certain: the trial lawyers have a lot of leverage and a lot of power in this state, and they've written laws for decades in this state. So there are abundance of laws in this state, whole legal frameworks which are written by trial lawyers and which benefit trial lawyers perhaps more than they do the general public. And this is certainly a movement to move in the other direction. However, this is an omnibus bill which is going to have impacts on numerous industries throughout the state. And so there are a lot of parties who are concerned, a lot of parties who feel positive about the bill, a lot of parties who feel negatively about the bill. So we'll see what actually ends up getting through the Senate, and then of course the House of Representatives in South Carolina. Most of the power players there are trial lawyers. So I don't know how far it's going to move there, but certainly there is a vigorous debate happening in the South Carolina Senate right now.
There is. And also credit where credit's due to the trial lawyers. We were speaking earlier, we'd been watching the Twitter feed of our friend Wes Donahue, who has been castigating the business lobby in South Carolina, basically saying that these guys are meeting in stuffy rooms with stuffy shirts and ties and talking about what they should do. And meanwhile, the trial lawyers have already dropped tons of money on rabid political operatives who are, I think the term was stepping on people's dicks. I think that was it. But anyway, the point being that trial lawyers are street fighters. And sometimes in South Carolina politics, street fighting, that is a skill you need to have when you go
Well,
to the
you've
state
been showing
house.
that this week, and I think that that's something that Wes Donahue is also known for
A
himself.
knife fighter, he calls himself. That's right. That's
He's
right.
told me he's outgrown that reputation. He's moved on. He's more sophisticated, but I don't know. I think he's still got it.
I don't know. The guy's got his like initials and signature embroidered on his like sleeves. So I don't know. How's a guy like that a knife fighter?
That's what I mean. Maybe he's a
Close
older man now,
horse, knife fighter.
but certainly don't count Wes Donahue out. And I think he's right. This has been pretty brutal on the behalf of the operatives of the trial lawyer lobby this week.
But credit to them again, though, for engaging the fight. It's not just getting that MAGA imprimatur and Donald Trump Jr. Again, they've had a very aggressive strategy. And again, it's a war at the state houses, as we're seeing on multiple fronts this past week. But as we go to press this week, as we close this episode out, folks, there are going to be a number of big announcements on all these races in the weeks to come. So keep it tuned to FITSNews, not only for the very latest on what's happening under the dome at the South Carolina State House on these important issues, but also on the campaign trail. We've been covering too much trials up here. Also on the campaign trail as candidates vie for these important offices here in the Palmetto State. Dylan, thanks for joining me on this segment. Thanks for your work on this murder trial up here in Greenville.
It's been a great week.
Absolutely. That's a wrap for this show, folks. Once again, your subscriptions empower everything we do. It's only $8 a month. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to FITSNews. It's this kind of independent journalism where we turn the mics over to anybody with an intelligent take on the issue. That's what we need to advance the debate in this state. That's how we're going to hold people accountable. And your subscriptions, again, empower that and everything we do here. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks to Dylan Nolan for not only doing all the work this week up in Greenville, but producing the show as well. And we'll catch you next time. on the Week in Review.